Hey guys, welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Bert Kreischer's 2016 special, The Machine. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. So we'll start off as usual with a little bit of background on Bert. This is the first of his 3 specials. I've seen all 3 of them. I'm a fan of Bert's. Another thing worth mentioning, the Machine story that this is named after went viral before this special came out. I had seen that particular bit multiple times before I watched, to the point that the first time I watched his special, I stopped watching once I got to that bit. But I haven't seen any of it for a while, and I couldn't really remember any of it as I watched it this time. His style is based around storytelling and observational comedy, but with all of that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. The show starts off with Bert giving a little bit of an introduction. It probably goes on a little bit longer than it needs to, but it's not bad. He also takes off his top at the start of the show, which is something I'll talk about a bit later, but he does this at all his shows. In the first bit, he talks about his kids. This is a little bit clunky, but there's a couple of really funny stories in there, and he branches off with some good jokes off that story, and his delivery is really, really good, but it is a little bit clunky in places. Afterwards, he talks about a time he went skydiving with Rachel Ray. He kind of talks through the skydiving, and it's a good story, but there's just not really enough jokes spread throughout it. He's kind of just telling the story, and the story itself isn't really funny enough to warrant how few jokes there are, but it's a fun story. Afterwards, he talks about his kid's first day at school, and this gets a little bit serious at times, but he breaks it up well with some really quite silly jokes in order to counteract the seriousness. It's not really the funniest bit, but it's still quite good. This leads into a story of him talking about a time his daughter left school early and he helped her do so. Now, this is a really, really funny story on its own. It doesn't really need any jokes off the side of the story, and he does well to keep it fairly concise, but also get everything he can out of it. After that, he changes tone a little bit. He starts talking about the difference in men and women's orgasms, and this has a really good piece of audience interaction, where he's not necessarily talking about the most obvious things, but it works really well. The audience member really gets involved, and they play off each other really well here. And the whole thing just kind of really brings the bit together in a way that I think he probably couldn't even hope for. It would have been a funny bit without the audience participation, but this really makes it stand out. He goes on to talk about meeting his wife, and here the setup is a little bit slow, but it really pays off later in the bit. It's a very slow build, but he knows he's got some really good stuff at the end of this bit. It bleeds into him talking about trying reverse cowgirl with his wife. It's kind of the opposite in that it's a very funny premise, and there are some good jokes sort of building up, but it's just not really quite as funny as you want it to be. It's definitely not bad, but it seems like there's something more to get from it. Afterwards, he talks about the difference between younger women and older women. There's a little bit of performance in this bit, and, well, throughout the whole show there's some performance, but there's a bit more than usual here. But it works really well. He's got a lot of jokes surrounding it, and the acting is for a joke rather than as an exaggeration or in place of a joke. It's a really, really good bit. Throughout the whole show, he does well to make any kind of performance or acting go alongside a joke rather than just being about that. He then talks a little bit more about his wife. There's a couple of good stories in there. He mentions that his wife told him not to mention one of the stories on stage, which he does really well. And also at the end of the list, he has a little run of dick jokes, which they very much fit within what he's talking about at the time, but they're all really well done, really well written. Telling dick jokes can be quite hard as a professional comedian because it's kind of the obvious thing to do, but they're very creative and very kind of unique, and done in a way that seems professional rather than just talking to your mates. The next story is about a hotel porter, and this is a really, really good story, but there's a lot of build-up, and you kind of feel like it's not going anywhere, or that wherever it is going isn't going to be worth the payoff. But there is a really great payoff at the end. There's a couple of false endings to it as well. And the way this story is told is so good to make you think that it's not going to be very good. But it really is worth seeing out to the end. He goes on to talk about fighting a bear, which the story in itself here is really funny. And he could probably have just relied on the story. But he has some great kind of jokes off it as well that really enhance the story and really show what he's capable of as a comic. Then the end of the show, he tells the machine story, which again, if you haven't seen it, is really good. I recommend you go and watch it, even if you just watch that on its own. This bit did go viral a few years before this special came out, but as he's telling it, you can tell that he's really got it nailed down. It's really well written, really well told, and he looks so comfortable as he's performing it. And it's a great way to end the show, and I don't think he could really have ended with anything else, because a lot of people would have been coming to the show specifically for this bit, which can be very difficult because if people are coming expecting something to be good, it can be quite hard to live up to. But even when you know the story, it's still so well done and so well performed. And the story itself is so funny, but again, Bert really manages to make it special each time he tells it. And Bert doesn't just rely on it being a funny story. He really goes for it every time he tells it, and every time it's so brilliant to listen to. So even though it's a bit that you already know and you kind of might have higher expectations for and you think it can't live up to, it's still a really, really good ending to the show. A few little extra things to mention regarding the show. His transitions are mostly very blunt cuts between bits. A few times he'll try to link bits, but these mostly come across quite clunky. In terms of a stage persona, he doesn't necessarily have a persona. He's kind of just himself on stage. But one thing he has that kind of gives him something unique and identifiable is that he always performs topless. It's not really a big thing, but at least it's something that separates him from everyone else. As for the audience, there's a couple of bits of audience participation, and they both work really great. Bert plays off them really well, and the audience members themselves really help the bit out. There are a few times where they're not reacting quite the way you would expect them to, and that can feel a little bit awkward. But overall, they're fine, and you don't really notice them as you're watching. Looking at the show as a whole, it's a good show, but it's not the best. You can tell it's his first special. It feels a little bit clunky in places, and he doesn't quite have an audience of his own yet. But it's still very funny, and Bert's a great stand-up comedian. Seeing how far he's come in his later specials is really good to see, and it'll be an interesting comparison when I review his later shows, but because this isn't quite at that level yet, I'm gonna have to give it a 6 out of 10. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter @standupreview and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day, and we'll see you for the next episode.